Hey, 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 welcome to the Heal with Gold show on this Wednesday, March 24th. I am so besides myself. I am so excited. I feel like I'm like a little girl in a candy store, and I don't even know the questions that I'm going to ask because I'm so excited. I have so much that I want to know. Everybody in my group, hi Marina, you all know that how much I love books, and that my new habit for 2021 was to ensure that I read one book a week, and I share with the group what these books are. So as I read them, and then I give them my comments, my feedback on those books. And you know that last year I came out with my first book, something that I really didn't think that I was going to do. But the book came out on the anniversary of my father's passing. It was such an emotional journey for me. It was so meaningful for me. And you know, books for me, the knowledge is something that we can get it for $15, $20, and we can gain such wisdom. And now I'm going to bring to you somebody who has brought to the world 5,000 books, connecting authors to the right publishers to get them out, plus all the books that he has written himself. I am so excited. For those in my email list, you got my emails, and I hope you felt that excitement. And without further ado, I'm going to bring Bill Gladstone, who's going to introduce himself, talk about his books, talk about his journey, and I hope you are taking notes, and I hope that you have questions, because at the end you will have an opportunity to ask those questions. Welcome, Bill Gladstone. How are you?
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm in Southern California, a beautiful sunny day. And this is the first time Miriam and I have ever spoken. So I was delighted with her enthusiasm for books, because my whole life has been about books. My father started a publishing company in 1936, Arco Publishing. It was mostly a how-to publishing company. It was the first publishing company that did test preparation books. I grew up from the age of 6 working with books. At the age of 6, he would have me and my brother go down to his office in New York and put price changes on books. We would then go for a fancy lunch at Luchau's, wonderful German restaurant. Then we'd come back, do more price changes, and then at 5 o'clock, he would open the door to the office next door. And the office next door happened to be DC Comics. So our payment was we could take any comic books we wanted. Had I known that these comic books were going to be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, I would have been the best paid 6-year-old in the history of book publishing, or perhaps in the history of the world. But I read the comics and unfortunately no longer retain them. But anyway, so that was my introduction. And by the time I was 16, I had really worked just about in every capacity. I had worked in editorial, I had worked in production, I had worked in the warehouse, I had gone on sales calls with our salesmen. I had even taken over one summer managing our bookstore, because we had our own bookstore. So I really had, you know, an amazing introduction to the world of book publishing. And of course, that doesn't include all the dinners where my father would always be talking about this book and that book and this deal and that deal. And my dad was a real innovator. He was the first person to sell books outside of bookstores. He had a collection of pet books, and he realized we should sell pet books in pet stores. And then he had a line of horse books, and he realized we should sell horse books at veterinarians. And so he was very, very creative. He was one of the first publishers to do vitamin E is key to a healthy heart. Let's sell it in a nutrition store, in a pharmacy. So he was a great innovator. I learned a lot from him. And then I also had a mother who just loved books. In fact, if it weren't for my mother, I would have never had this background in publishing, because during the Second World War, my father left his company in the hands of a good friend who was very brilliant, but not a good business person. So when my father returned from the war, his company was actually in debt. And his accountant said, "Mr. Gladstone, I don't see how you're going to get out of this debt." Through a series of really miraculous circumstances, he did get out of debt. But the motivation was my mom, because when he left that meeting with the accountant, he came home and he said, well, the accountant says I should declare bankruptcy. You know, I can open a liquor store or a shoe store. I can do something else. We can, earn a good living. And my mother was the one who said, no, sir, Mr. Gladstone, I married a book publisher and you're going to find a way to remain a book publisher. Because my mother just loved books. She read at least a book a week. I mean, I think she read a book a day. She was always reading, and she really encouraged me to be a writer, which was ironic because my father did not. My father was too close to the business. He said, writers, they're a dime a dozen. We buy and sell them and none of them ever make a living. 1 out of 100 established writers make a living as nice as you're accustomed to. I don't think you should do this. But my mother, no, you can change the world through a book and, there's nothing like being an author. So when I was 14 or 15, my mom gave me a copy of Camus' notebooks. Albert Camus, had won the Nobel Prize for Literature. He's best known for The Stranger and a dozen of his other novels. They were, he was sort of along with Sartre, the two big names in philosophical writing, and used novels to convey their ideas about existentialism and other ideas. In any event, I read Camus' notebooks. I had read some of his novels, The Fall, I think, and The Stranger, but it was really in his notebooks that I was hooked. The writing in Camus' notebooks, if you ever get a chance, is brilliant. And to me, it was sort of like the inner workings of a really brilliant mind. And so that really got me thinking. And then just a year later, I had an assignment. I went to school for a year. It was called School Year Abroad, a special program. I studied in Barcelona. It was my junior year in high school. And the English teacher gave us an assignment of keeping a journal because we were in a different country and he thought it would be very interesting for us to see what we were observing. So I started keeping a journal and I was inspired by Camus. Anyway, so I kept that journal for a full 2 years and really fell in love with writing. And interestingly, 2 years later, when I was a freshman at Yale, I was able to take a graduate school course, even as a freshman, with Jerzy Kosinski, who had just won the National Book Award for Painted Bird. And, it was an extra course, and, I was a freshman and I was doing a lot of different things. And so the end of the term came and we had been asked to do a writing assignment. That would be our whole grade. And I was like, oh my gosh, I don't have time to write, a 20-page paper. It's due in 2 days. So I came up with the idea. The course was called Time of Life, Time of Art. And so I took my journals and I just sort of took selections and added a little bit to it and turned it in. So, a week later, I get my interview with Jerzy Kosinski. And I'm nervous. I think, oh my gosh, I hope he's not upset because I didn't write anything new. So he had a Polish accent. He was from Poland. And he tells me, well, everyone who comes through this door to meet with me wants to hear that they have great promise as a writer and that they should pursue it. And the reality is, I've never told any of them that because it's not true. But with you, it is true. You definitely have real talent and you should pursue a career as a writer. So now, that was, I went home, I think over Christmas vacation, I wrote a play or something. I was so inspired. So that really, sort of convinced me that, yes, I should definitely write. Now, this was a bit of a dilemma because the kinds of books my father was publishing were books like Score High on the Real Estate Exam, How to Pass the Medical College Admission Test. And he wanted me to write those kinds of books. And I did. And I was a published author, in my teens, and those books sold lots of copies, but, nothing to do with me so much as people needed to take the test. So, that kind of writing my father approved of. But creative writing a novel, that's not such a good idea. But now I had this double motivation from my mother and from, a recognized established author. So I did write. And I wrote a novel few years later, which I called Suicide Plus, because I had broken up with my girlfriend and I was going through a difficult time. And it was really a way of dealing with the emotions that I had, which were, frankly, at the time, suicidal. And it was really the writing of that novel that kind of saved my life in a way, because I got all caught up in the writing. And I give you all this background because there's a lot of reasons to write that have nothing to do with getting published or making money. Most people just think of it that way. But just writing can be a life-saving and adventure. So right before I had written that novel, I wrote a book, and I've got a revised copy of it. At the time, this was the book. It was called How to Test Your Own Mental Health. This is a new edition that we just came out with because of the pandemic. There's a rise in suicide. And there's lots of keys here that somebody can use to spot if someone in their family is suicidal or in danger of, a mental breakdown. Anyway, so I had written this book, and this book was very popular, sold about 250,000 copies. I was on the Today Show. I was interviewed by Safford Channing, and, I'm in my mid-20s for all this. So I wrote this novel, Suicide Plus, and I bring it to my editor at New American Library, which was part of one of the big publishers of the time. And I sit down with the editor, and the editor says, I really liked it. It reminded me of James Joyce's Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man. I said, oh, that's great. So you want to publish it? Says, well, no, we wouldn't sell but 100 or 200 copies. You're not famous enough for us to publish a book like that. But you're a good writer, so why don't you write a mystery or a thriller or something? And then years later, when you're famous, we can publish your sort of coming of age Suicide Plus. So I said, well, I'm not really interested in writing something just for the sake of writing it. I can make money doing something else. I'll just wait till I'm really famous. And so I love that. However, what's interesting is I'm famous enough. I mean, because I wrote another novel. Let's see, I think I brought a copy. So about 10 years ago, I wrote this novel, 12, which went on to sell over 500,000 copies. And that's enough so that, I can probably get anything published I want once you have a track record. So the issue for me is I reread my novel that I wrote in my 20s, and I'm not sure I even want to have it published now because, it reflects the world then. And I think the Me Too movement would be very much opposed. It's a very sexist novel. That was the times. And there's other things. It is brilliant, and I may take out little pieces of it and sort of, I haven't really figured it out. But so even though I wrote that novel and I got a lot of positive feedback, most likely that novel will never be published. And yet the 6 months I spent writing it were probably some of the most valuable time I ever spent getting to know myself, perfecting my skills as a writer. So, I think people should understand that it's not all about fame and fortune. There's a lot of other reasons. Now, one of the other things that happened to me when I was at Yale is I was fortunate enough to study with Amy Rodriguez Monegal. He was the biographer of Luis Borges, the famous Argentinian writer. And it was actually another graduate, I don't know why. I was a freshman, I was taking graduate school courses that, I spoke Spanish already and they let me into these courses. This course was actually taught by the head of the history department and by Amy Rodriguez Monegal. I was the only undergraduate in the course. Everyone else was a graduate student in comparative literature. And the whole theme of the course was comparing North American writers to South American writers. And this was in 1968. And Cien Años de Soledad by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, had not yet been translated into English. It was only available in Spanish. So for this course, you had to read 2 books a week. And this is just one course. I mean, I can't even imagine how I did it. But in 1 week, we had to read Cien Años de Soledad in Spanish and Absalom by Faulkner in English. And then compare them, because the reason was that Gabriel Garcia Marquez had officially spoken about how great an influence Faulkner had been in his own writing. But in any event, so I fell in love with this book. I've read this book, Cien Años de Soledad, probably a dozen times. I ended up for a year teaching, and I taught this book. And I wrote my thesis, which I won some big award. Can't remember what it was called, but it was a big award at Yale. And then fast forward 30 years later, when my novel, The 12, was translated into Spanish, it ended up being under the auspices of the same editor who was Gabriel Garcia Marquez's editor. So through that relationship, we had communication. And in my mind, Gabriel Garcia Marquez is the greatest author of the last 150 years in any language. I mean, if you've never read Cien Años de Soledad or Love in the Time of Cholera, but Cien Años de Soledad particularly, I think, is just a head and shoulders above any other novel that I can think of. In any event, so I send him a copy of my novel.
In English is 100 Years of Solitude.
Yeah, and the English translation is excellent. You don't need to read it in Spanish. But in the book I have, of course, which is in Spanish, Gabriel García Márquez changed Cien Años de Soledad, up here you can see. I don't know if I show it. Soledad. He changes it to Felicidad, and it's all in Spanish, Felicidad, para William Gladstone, con un gran abrazo, with a big embrace to my colleague and friend. So of all my possessions, this is my most cherished.
Wow.
He's my favorite author of all time, my favorite book of all time. And so I'm very touched by that. So that's a little bit of a background on sort of my journey. I guess I should include some of the business. So my father sold his company. So I was hired away by the underbidder. When he sold the company, the underbidder was Harcourt Brace Jovanovich. And it's a very small world, or it used to be in publishing. William Jovanovich's first job in publishing had been for my father at Arco. Anyway, so he knew the company, he knew me. He hired me, fired 7 people, and I replaced all 7 and was sent out to California to set up Harcourt Brace's first West Coast office. And so I acquired books for Harcourt for about 2 years, but my real goal was to get into the movie business. And I had written a treatment, and I took it up to a major agency in Los Angeles, and they said, well, this is great. I think you can make a great movie. But you know, you need to understand that once we pitch it, you're not going to be involved in the writing. You know, there's going to be somebody else. And I said, well, that's not really my goal. I really wanted to, you know, sort of at least be the head writer, if not the producer or co-producer. How much do you think it's going to cost to make this movie? He said, at the time, you have to remember, this is 30 years ago, $20 million. I said, well, that doesn't seem to me to be that much money. I'm going to just wait. So life is what happens when you're busy making other plans. So I created my little production company, started, you know, making a few small how-to films, actually. And while that was happening, the authors that I had signed at Harcourt found out that Harcourt didn't want to do their books if I were, you know, they didn't have an editor who really understood, because I was always ahead of the sort of mainstream, if you will. So I had signed Dr. Virginia Livingston Wheeler, who was the very first female doctor in New York City, and also the first doctor who identified diet as a cause, or one of the causes, of cancer. And unfortunately, it was actually impossible for Harcourt to publish her book, but I didn't know it at the time, because Harcourt at the time published the industry magazine for the chicken industry. And the main culprit Dr. Virginia had found was the way chickens were being raised. So they just had to cancel the book. So she found me and said, well, what do I do? And I said, oh, I know a lot of people in New York. I'll find you a publisher. That's not so hard. So I did it. And I also found her a writer, because she needed a writer. So I had this little sideline while I was producing films, because she said, well, you know, you should get paid. I said, you're right. I need to get paid. I'm an agent. That's what I've done. We take 15%. Good. And then I had a couple of other books. I had another one that I had signed, and this one was canceled because they just didn't understand it. It was by David Loy, and it was called The Sphinx and the Rainbow. And it was about the holographic model of the universe and how it is possible that the future already exists. And that you can actually find it. you can find a way to enter the future. And this was pretty heady, and they didn't really get it. And so they canceled that book. It was the same thing. David said, Bill, now that you're gone, they don't want to do my book. What do I do? I said, I know people. And I found him, actually, it was Shambhala, which was very interesting, because Ken Wilber, who's now a famous author himself, was the editor-in-chief, and he understood the book, and they published it. And that book actually went out of print 10 years later, and I resold it to another publisher, and they retitled it An Arrow Through Time. But anyway, there were some other books like that. So I had this little agenting business on the side while I was trying to do my films. And out of nowhere, I had the opportunity to start representing computer books. I was friends with Andy Kay, who was the founder of K-Pro Computer, and he had asked me to do a favor for him, which I did. I found someone, he had another device called the Tudor computer, and he needed a person who was a wordsmith who could also create an audio version of this book that he had funded by the Johnson O'Connor Foundation, which listed every word in the English language in order of use. So, the words that are used most frequently in the beginning, and then ever more sophisticated level. And Andy was particularly interested in this because the Johnson O'Connor Foundation was dedicated to trying to improve efficiency. So they had come up with a whole list of qualities and attributes that were associated with success, and then could then be matched, to different professions. And of all the aptitudes they measured, vocabulary was the most important. The higher your vocabulary, the more likely you were to be successful. And this was more than your socioeconomic class or your level of education. So this was really pretty amazing. So I had helped him I was interested in this, so I helped him find someone and was really overseeing that project. So I would go to K-Pro Computer, and K-Pro went from being a $2.5 million nonlinear systems company creating some kind of, I don't even know what you call it, oscilloscope, something to do with airlines, something beyond my capability. But while he was doing that, he had his engineers working on this computer, which became the K-Pro computer, which at the time you had K-Pro, Osborne, and IBM, and that was it. So they went from $2.5 million of this rarefied machine to selling $250 million a year of this luggable. It was pretty heavy compared to today's computers. So he had a room of like 20 documentation writers, and they found out about me, and they approached me and said, our buddies at Osborne are writing these books and getting advances from New York publishers. Can you help us? So I went to Andy and I said, what do you think? Oh, be my guest. If they're writing books on their time, it doesn't bother me, and then they won't need raises. They'll be happy. I said, okay. So overnight, we became the leading source of information about computers. And I personally represented probably the first 500 to 1,000 computer titles. In fact, I remember one year alone, I did 299 computer-related books. And that's all I did. I was so busy, I didn't have time to do any other kind of books. But it didn't matter because it was intellectually stimulating, not the books themselves, because I never read any of them because I didn't even use any of the equipment. But I was representing InfoWorld, so I would receive the magazine every week, which would talk about the industry and what was happening. And I ended up with a very simple formula. Any product that was advertised with a full-page ad 4 weeks in a row was worthy of a book. Because whether the product was good or not, there was marketing behind it. And this actually will be related to information you may want to know about how to get started yourselves, because marketing is really the key behind everything. We'd like to think it's great art, but it's really more about marketing. In any event, so our agency just took off. I ended up having to hire more people. And collectively now, we ended up creating, and we represented the who's who. We ended up Peter Norton and Linus Torvalds and really the people that created the actual internet. We had a ball, and it was always exciting and interesting, and we made lots and lots of money. It was just fun. Some of those books, sold. I mean, one of them sold over 14 million copies over several years, but still a lot of copies. And we had at least a dozen books sell 1 million or more copies. And that's very rare in publishing. People hear about big numbers and Stephen King and Grisham and a few others, but there's actually probably not more than 5 or 10 books a year in all genres that sell 1 million or more copies. So to have 10 or more, and they were all from first-time authors, really, was really remarkable. And it gave me the freedom to really do just about whatever I want. When the internet crashed, I was already getting a little bit bored, because now it's sort of like, I don't want to sort of throw water on anyone's parade. And there's technology people out there who will still tell us why whatever technology they're developing is still going to change the world. And I know we have AI and augmented reality, and there's still some cool things happening. But from my perspective, it doesn't have near the impact, the revolutionary impact that the first computers, the first Apples, the first Excel spreadsheet, the first Word Perfect, all those products really were having dramatic impact. So, and the bloom was off the rose as well, because once the internet was really established, who needs a book? Some people prefer books, but we used to sell, you know, I just remember royalties. We used to get $600,000 a month just in royalties from our dummies books, just our dummies books. Now we get maybe $600,000 a year. So it's less than 1/10 as many books being sold annually about technology as, you know, in the 80s and early 90s. So as those events happened, and I also, you know, still had, you know, because the technology side, I would say, was more my father's influence, you know, find something and exploit it, and, you know, it's fun and making money is good. And then my mother's side was more, you know, write books that are going to change the world, that are going to touch people's heart and soul. So through, really, it was through David Loy, one of my first clients, that I was introduced to Dr. Ervin Laszlo. And Dr. Laszlo is really a remarkable human being. He started his life as a pianist. At the age of 9, he was already a concert pianist and a rock star. His life, he really saved his life and his family's life because he was so talented. Because during World War II, the Spanish consulate in Budapest said it would be such a pity if this talent were lost to the world. So he took Ervin and his family in the consulate, where they were safe from what would have been, you know, they would have gone to concentration camps. So, you know, he had that experience. Then by the time he was 15, he was already playing Carnegie Hall, and he had this great career as a musician. But his uncle had been a professor of philosophy. So he always had this interest in philosophy. And even though he had never gone to school, he was brilliant. And as a hobby, he started reading and thinking about these topics and systems theories. He was a big fan of Whitehead, who was probably the greatest systems theorist, you know, ever existed. So at one of his concerts, he was sitting next to a man, and they were talking about all these science topics. And the man at the end of the dinner said, you know, this is really fascinating. Have you ever thought of writing anything down? So, oh yeah, I have a full manuscript. He said, oh, can I see it? Okay. So he gave him the manuscript. Of course, that night he went into a terror because they didn't have Xerox machines or even, you know, copies. It was his only copy. But fortunately, the man he gave it to was the head of the largest science magazine in the Netherlands. And he also had a publishing company. And so he convinced Ervin to do some rewriting, and they published it. And so now Ervin had a second career as a science systems theorist. And he quickly became, because Whitehead had passed, he became the leading systems theorist in the world. And he was invited to Yale, and he was invited to other universities, and he slowly sort of merged away from giving concerts to being a full-time scientist. Wow. And while he was a full-time scientist, he was asked, he joined the Club of Rome, which issued, I think it was 1972, or maybe it was 76, I'm not sure when, but early on in the 70s, the first report on the climate crisis that was already, to the scientists, visible, that we were entering a period where man's activity was altering the climate in ways that were not really very healthy for the planet or for human beings. But no one was paying attention. So they asked Ervin, they said, well, you know, we're living in a society where, you know, maybe Liz Taylor or Liv Ullmann or Ingrid Bergman or Yo-Yo Ma, or, you know, some of these musicians, and you're kind of part of that world. So why don't you create like a poet and writers club, and you can take our message out through the mainstream. So he did that. He called the Club of Budapest, because that's where he was originally from. And at that time, the government in Budapest gave him some support. So he created this great club, which included the Dalai Lama and Peter Gabriel, and, you know, a lot of famous people. And because I was his agent, he ended up inviting my wife and I to be international trustees. So we ended up meeting with Jane Goodall and all these wonderful people. But it opened the floodgates for me to start representing these kinds of books. And it was very much what interested me, because it was not complete woo-woo, but it wasn't traditional science either. It was kind of a combination. And the first big success we had in this space was Ervin Laszlo's Science in the Akashic Field, published by Inner Traditions. And and Ervin had been writing, he had already written 20 or 30 books by the time I started representing him, but none of them had sold more than 4,000 or 5,000 copies. And partly that was because he wasn't really thinking about the audience. He was thinking about his ideas. And that was one of the few books, and I haven't done this for any author since, but I actually took it. In the beginning, it was a 90-page manuscript, and I spent almost 6 months rewriting it for him. And then after that, I hired Peter Gazzardi, who had edited Hawking's Brief History of Time, to totally edit it. So we did end up with a book that captured really cutting-edge science, but in a way that anybody, with maybe a high school education could understand it. And that book has gone on. I think it's up to close to 200,000 copies sold. And that's one of my proudest sort of agenting achievements. Mm-hmm. But, since then, I represent Neale Donald Walsch, Conversations with God. I've represented special projects for Marianne Williamson, for Deepak Chopra, and Marie Kondo. Once you're known for a certain skill, and unlike most of the agents, I never, if you go on our website, our mission statement is to help authors and publishers create and distribute books to create a better world. And that's really true. I mean, I don't mind making money, and I'm not oblivious to money, and I enjoy money, but it's never been that important to me. So that, particularly for these kinds of authors, because, like Eckhart Tolle, Eckhart still is not motivated. He has all these opportunities, but, these authors resonate with that larger vision and that larger purpose. They don't want an agent just who's going to get them a, quote, better deal. They want someone who shares their level of integrity and purpose. So I've been, very fortunate. I only work with people I like to work with. And, most of the books we've represented have really made significant contributions. So that's my story. And in terms of your story, anyone that's listening to this can and should write a book. Doesn't mean you should write a book and publish your book, because that is a different story. That really depends on what your resources are and what you hope to achieve with your book. If your book is going to promote your business, definitely should, invest in that and publish it. If your book is more just for your family legacy, maybe you don't need to publish it, or maybe you should just self-publish it. But today, it's almost impossible, if you don't already have what they call a big author platform, to get a publishing contract with a major New York publisher. It almost doesn't matter how good your content is. I could take the same manuscript on a self-help topic, and if Gwyneth Paltrow was the author of one version, and someone without any following was the author, the Gwyneth Paltrow version I would sell, even though it were identical. They were identical. And that's just the way the world is working right now. Occasionally, and Eckhart is the exception. At the time Eckhart's first book was published, nobody knew who he was. He didn't have a platform. But sometimes you get lucky. In his case, the luck was Meg Ryan got hold of a copy. She gave it to Oprah. Oprah fell in love with it. Next thing you know, she's doing this incredible webinar with him, and selected the first book as one of her favorite things for Thanksgiving. So things, you can get lucky, but you can also win the lottery. So it's not strategy. I do have a book. I didn't find it right now. There's a book that just came out from another one of my clients who I love very much, Gay Hendricks and Carol Klein, Conscious Luck. Mm-hmm. And in my own book, I think, Be the Deal, this is my business biography. I think I have a section on how to create your own luck, because you can create your own luck, but still there's levels of luck. And you need to be in a place where you don't need luck. You just can benefit from the luck. Sending out, I need something. The universe doesn't respond to that. I have something to give. The universe responds to that. So, you need to be very self-aware of why you're writing a book and how you hope to use the book. Most books do not make any money. And I'm talking about published books. I'm talking about from major publishers. The average book published by a legitimate publisher sells 5,000 or fewer copies. The average self-published book sells 200 or fewer copies. So it's difficult to actually sell books. And as difficult as it may be to write a book, marketing the book is even more difficult. And you have to be willing to self-market and self-promote. I'm very fortunate. I don't mind doing interviews. I love doing interviews, actually. And I don't mind mentioning, my books. But I have a whole staff of people that actually do the marketing. I don't even understand it. I pay for it, but that's it. And, that's the way I like it. And sometimes the marketing works and sometimes it doesn't. But you need to go into this world of writing and getting your book published with your eyes wide open, because it's not easy. And most projects will be financial losses from the perspective of generating the revenue through book sales that you invested. But that doesn't mean it was a loss, because the benefits, I have authors who have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to guarantee that their book would end up on the New York Times list. You can't really do that anymore. They've gotten on to how you play that game. It was actually more like $500,000. And they only generated maybe $50,000 or $100,000 in royalties. So you say, my God, this is crazy. They lost $400,000. But in their cases, they had businesses that thrived. In one case in particular, every referral was worth $1,000 to that author. So, she sold 1,000, she got 1,000 referrals. That was her $1 million back. It was a very successful venture. But there's very few situations like that. So, I encourage people to write no matter what. I encourage people to publish if they're prepared to go through the process. And we've created a course called The Power of Publishing, and we go into much more detail, sort of what's the difference self-publishing.
After the event, I will share all your information, because if anybody's interested, Yeah,
and one of the reasons I created that course was I get emails every day, and I'm sure you do. Oh, 5 easy steps to becoming a New York Times bestselling author. And I'm so aggravated when I see these emails, some of which are even from clients of mine. It's like, that's not true. It's not easy, but as I've been told by the marketing people, but Bill, you make it sound too difficult. No one's going to take your course. And I said, well, those who do will benefit. That's good enough for me, and we'll see. But you have to be cautious. There's a lot of marketing people that are making more money marketing your book than you'll ever make from the book sales. So just be cautious.
100%. When I decided to write a book, I never thought that I would write in my life. And the main reason that I thought I would never write is because I'm a foreigner, and I didn't feel that I had such good grasp on the language to write in English. And my father he wrote many books, and his language is so beautiful. I felt that I would be an embarrassment, coming after him. But when he passed away, I wanted to write a book because I knew this would make him so happy. And I ended up releasing my book on the anniversary of his passing. When I released my book, and I think you touched on something very important, is to figure out what is the reason that you want to write a book. I did not have any intentions of making money with my book. I wanted to do this for my father because I knew he was smiling. And I wanted the message out because I wanted to do good. I wanted, like you said, to bring goodness to the world. And I have had, since the book came out, and I pretty much self-published, and I didn't do any marketing because my life became very crazy after. I've had people who read the book and came to me, either they asked me to coach them, or they have mentioned exactly how the book was helpful in their healing journey. And I think that the joy that I got from that was the payment that I wanted. And that's what I got. So for me, it's not the financial gain, but it is this heartwarming knowledge that you put something out there that can contribute to somebody else's life. That is priceless. And I agree with you that everyone should write. And I talk in my group, writing is healing. When you write down, even sometimes I'm so mad and I want to say something to somebody, and instead of saying, I write what I want to say and I give it some time, and then when I read it, I don't send it. It was enough to get it off my chest, but not to create a situation that I would say something that would hurt somebody else. So writing is healing. Not everybody needs to publish, but writing is so important. But I have to tell you, when I hold my book in my hand, there is something magical. And I said to my husband, this is my birthday present for last year. I said, the cost it's going to create, that it's going to be involved with this, that's my birthday present. And I think that if people go about it this way and lower their expectations, I think that everybody wants to be the next chicken soup for the soul. You know, that doesn't happen very often. And but I think that you're 100% right. But it's such a magnificent feeling.
Yeah, it makes me think of two things. First, I'm very good friends with Jack Canfield, who did.
I know you are.
I actually wrote with him. It's really his autobiography, but he didn't have time to write it, so I wrote it, called The Golden Motorcycle Gang. And Jack is, one of my favorite people of all time. And he has a business and had a business. And even if that book hadn't sold, the book benefited his business greatly. And now in his case, the book did sell. It's one of the best-selling series of all time. But he did not have overnight success with that. He was turned down by, I think, 100 publishers or something. It's a lot of publishers, and he went with a really small publisher. So he is sort of the exception, and it can happen, though I think it's harder to happen today than 30, 40 years ago. The other memory that you spark in me is when I received an email. I'm not sure if it was an email or a letter from a adolescent who read my novel, The 12. And one of the things that happens in The 12 is I combine all the different religious groups in the world, including atheists. They're all combined in one event where they have to cooperate together to save the world. And this is actually more in line with the true prophecy of the Mayans. And the Mayans themselves have kind of endorsed my book and said this is the only one that really captures. Forget the movie. So I'm very grateful to the movie because it was because of the movie and everyone's misinterpretation, thinking that the movie was based on my book, that I sold so many copies. But in any event, this one adolescent who was raised in a very strict religious Catholic Christian environment wrote and said that for the first time, he was considering that other religions may have truth too. And I thought that was, because, that's one person who actually wrote a letter, but there were probably hundreds or maybe even thousands of other people who had that realization. And, even if your book only reaches 100 people, if 2 or 3 have that kind of life-changing experience because of your book has had a profound positive impact, because it's through books that we're able to consider situations that we're not comfortable with. We're able to consider characters that we're not necessarily inclined to like and agree with. And so it's through the safety of a book that people can really push their boundaries and become better at coping with the disparities of the actual world in which we live. And through that, I think that's one of the reasons, we've always talked about liberal arts, about the benefits of college aren't just so that you get a better job and you make more money and all that stuff, but it's also so you'll be a better human being. You'll be a better informed human being. You'll be someone capable of interacting with different kinds of people, better understanding of other cultures. And, I'm kind of sick of all this, diversity. We don't, all these, but the reality is it is important, but it's important from the beginning. It's important to understand that we're all human beings and that we can all benefit from interacting with each other. And it's not about calling attention to one race versus another and, trying to change history. I mean, all that is bunk, but actually appreciating what each culture in the world has brought and continues to bring. That's important. So that's something that books capture in a way that almost no other medium can.
I love what you said, because I started thinking about books that I read before and how it opened my mind to different cultures, made me fall in love with characters that are, if you would say this person is going to be a friend, I would say never. But then after I read the book and I understood what their pains, their journey, yes, I want this person in my life. And otherwise I would have never had access, because, our worlds are small if we don't open up and start listening to people's experiences and cultural differences. But yeah, book is all that. I want to know, can I put up some of the questions that we're getting?
Absolutely, yeah. We only have about 15 minutes left, so we should roll into questions.
Yes. So, okay, I want to give you a little bit of a background on Eric. Eric was a guest in my show. He was shot in his throat, and he is wheelchair bound. One of the most inspiring people that I know. We keep in touch, and everybody's asking him for a book. And I asked Eric to come today because I want his book. I want to read his book.
Well, you can. How many people are on the call? Because I don't want to give my email out to too many people. But or maybe afterwards you can give Eric my email. But Eric, you can email me at my private email, and I will hook you up with our managing editor. And we have a list of ghostwriters, and you have to pay them, of course, but let us know your budget, and I mean, this is one of the reasons, because we sold so many books and were mentioned in the acknowledgments. Amazon actually approached us almost 10 years ago and said, we have this special program for the top agents in the country, and we want you to publish your books through us, and we'll cover all the expenses and this, that, and the other. And, I said, well, why are you wanting to do that? And he said, well, we want you to skip the New York publishers and come straight to us. And I said, well, I see you're paying 3 times higher royalties, but they're paying $1 million advances and you're not. And my job is to protect my authors. And I got to take the bird in hand with, 3 in the bush. So I said, there's some special situations, authors who want to get a book out quickly, authors who, are going to sell primarily just to their own audience already. So we'll do that, but then you have to make available this service to any of the authors I represent. So they do. So now we're publishing 50, 60 titles a year. And so we've built up a nice infrastructure. Some of our books are winning awards, and it is hybrid in that the author does have to cover the upfront expenses, but we have editors, we have cover designers, we have proofreaders, we have ghostwriters, we have marketing experts. So we have all of the resources that someone like you should explore. And in the end, even though we have a small fee that we charge to cover our own staff, you're going to save money because everyone who works with Waterside has been conditioned to know that unless they provide their best services at their lowest price, they're not going to be included for future referrals. And unlike everybody else in this business, we refuse to take any referral fees. We want everything clear and upfront. So we ask them, instead of giving us a 10 or 20% referral fee, give that discount to the client.
Wow.
So Eric, well, we definitely can help you.
Fantastic. I'll share your information with him. Next question. What are your thoughts on hiring ghostwriters for those of us with ideas but poor writing?
I think it's an excellent idea. You should write the basic concepts yourself, and maybe even a sample chapter or 2 so that they have a feeling for your voice. But I have several authors who've never written a word in their own books, and they're best-selling authors. I mean, it's nothing to be ashamed of. Not all of us enjoy the process. And if you don't enjoy the process, or you weren't educated in a way that writing is comfortable for you, don't torture yourself. Work with a good ghostwriter.
I know a few people that recorded their books.
Well, you can record it, but then you still should have at least what I would call a book doctor or developmental editor, because right. You take that recording, you transcribe it, but it's a little bit different if some people may just be naturals, but in most cases, the dictation is not going to be exactly the way the book should be. And right. The big thing about books that people don't understand, the writing of the book, the writing of the first draft is the easy part. It's the rewriting.
Oh my God. Oh my God. I remember, I have to tell you, that part is hard. The going over and over and over, I think I had like 5-6 rounds of revisions.
Well, particularly because if you're dictating a book and it's a 200-page book, it's very likely that you're going to forget that you already said something in chapter 1 that you now are repeating in chapter 6, and you've got to go through. You don't want that repetition. So
100%. Okay, next question. How do you pick the best title for a nonfiction book?
Well, every case is separate. And there's techniques. You can spend. I mean, I've had publishers spend $10,000 or more hiring branding companies to try to come up with a title. I don't believe in that. Brainstorming with people who are familiar with you and your book is a good way. Looking at other titles that have sold well is a good way. Eat This, Not That was a great title. Now, you may have nothing to do with eating, but it could be this, not that. But so you can play off of other people's successes, but there's no formula that is going to work for everyone.
I'll tell you, I had 15 titles that I wrote, and then I put them in my groups, and I put them in other areas, and I asked people which are their top 3, and then I posted again in the bigger groups which one is the top. And it was very interesting because the one that I liked best was not picked. People didn't understand it. So sometimes,
well, that's often the case, yeah. And I forget what it's called, Monkey Poll or something. There's these polling software apps that some of the publishers we work with do use. And if you have a group, like you're in a writing group, or in this case your course, if you have 20 or 30 people, yeah, I think it's a very good idea to use that group. Maybe you brainstorm, you come up with 10 possible titles, and you send out the list of 10 and see which ones get the most votes.
Exactly. And I think also that taking something from the book, like if you summarize the book in a sentence, what would that sentence be? And then from there, develop what should come out.
Yeah, and you look at titles that have been successful. Eat, Pray, Love. They're very simple. I mean, right. Eat, Pray, Love. You didn't really know what the book was about, but as soon as you started reading it, oh, okay.
Then you connected it, yeah. Is it better to go with a small publisher or wait for a larger one? We were approached by a small publishing company 6 years ago to write a book, but we were unable to commit. Should we go back to the one or seek a larger company?
Well, it depends on the track record of the small company. If they have a good track record, excuse me, you're probably better off going back to them, because unless you, in the last 6 years, have become very famous, you're going to have a hard time getting a big publisher. Big publishers are not even going to look at what you've written unless you can get a major literary agent. And getting a major literary agent isn't that easy. So you may not really have a choice here. But be sure that this small publishing company, ask them, what are the most successful books you've published in the last 5 years? What is the average sale of your average book? And, go in with your eyes wide open, and, are they an independent publisher with the traditional model where they're paying you, or is it more of a hybrid publisher where you're paying them?
I have a question. My father wrote a book 2 years before of his passing. It was his, this project was his life. And it was a 600-page book, too long. And no matter how much we told him, cut it, but my father was he was a lawyer. He had to, he couldn't cut it. I was thinking to shorten the book, rewrite it, and make it into up to 300-page book.
Well, it depends on the nature of the book, but if there's a convenient place to cut it, maybe you have 2 300-page books, volume 1 and volume 2. So that's one way to do it. It depends on if it's a memoir and you really need, beginning to end. But if it's more didactic, there may be, well, we're going to cover this area of the law in volume 1, and then we're going to cover these other areas in volume 2. So, or, most books, I mean, I always like to quote Mark Twain. I would have written you a shorter letter if I'd only had more time. Most manuscripts can be cut. It's interesting. I have a new client, and he sent me his novel, and I don't really do novels. It's more of a memoir, but it's a special situation. He's a friend of a friend. And 90% of the clients I take on are just referrals from people I've represented. And, we don't really take strangers very often. But in any event, it's 400 pages, and I'm in the middle of it. And he's a good writer, but it's like my first comment to him is going to be, we could easily make this 300 pages. There's almost nothing that won't be improved by cutting 15, 20, 30%.
Right. Yeah, it's complicated. Eric has a follow-up question. He says, one of the good things is that I've done 55 interviews since September. So he has a lot of content. What do you think about using content from interviews?
I think it's fine, but you need to have, you can't let the interviews dictate the structure of your book. You have to have a structure and a concept, and fit the interviews into it so that one interview supports a previous interview and that you have an overriding theme and an arc to the book. Because otherwise it's just a collection of interviews, and it needs to be more than that.
Do you change the name when you're doing interviews? When you're bringing interviews into a book, do you need to get permission from everybody?
Well, yes, you need to get permission. That's the main thing. And it's highly recommended, if the interviewer is giving examples, that you change the names or get permission from the people being mentioned. Because if they're not public figures, it's an invasion of privacy. And you don't want to do that. That said, if you slip up, I actually have never had a book that I've been involved with result in a lawsuit. So it's not as big a problem as people make it out to be. But you should, obviously, if something unpleasant is said about someone, definitely you don't want to, have them be identifiable unless they're a public figure, in which case, they can't sue you because they're a public figure.
I have one more question about publishers. Do they market the book at all? You have the Sun writing.
Yeah, the Sun it's just that time. I don't know. We changed plans. Usually the Sun just came right in my face. But your question again? Do
publishers do any marketing? Because
as little as possible. I hate to say they pretend to, but if you're really good at marketing, you're going to go into a field where you're selling things like cars that, generate billions of dollars, not books, which,
pennies
rarely generate more than a few $1 million. So there's always exceptions. And I've worked with some of the best book marketing people at the best book companies, but as a rule, they're not wonderful at what they do compared to, true marketing, what I consider true marketing. And their budgets are very low. And the way I describe it is, a publisher can't get your car going from 0 to 20. They're pretty good at taking a car already going 20 miles an hour and getting it to 60. So once you've already shown that you can market and sell your book, they can do some things that are helpful. The main marketing that publishers do is co-op ads with Barnes & Noble and Amazon to be sure that you get visibility in the stores and on the Amazon site. They have a PR division that does, 2 weeks of, intense work trying to get you on radio and TV and increasingly blogs. And I just got, the publishers try. I was just on a conference call with 9 people, and it was all about the marketing of a book from an author that we're, releasing. It's a first-time author, wonderful book, Awakening to the Fifth Dimension. And I'm hopeful that some of the things they're going to do are going to be effective. But I've already told my author, in this case, Kimberly Meredith, you should really plan on hiring your own PR and your own social media manager. And, they're going to do their best, but, they're publishing hundreds of books, thousands of books annually. They're not going to be able to give you the full-time commitment that you can give yourself.
Bill, I don't know how to thank you. I loved everything that you shared, your story, your journey, how you got to do what you're doing. We share this love for books. I'm grateful. I'm going to wait to receive from Christopher all of the links to post it in all of on my Facebook page and in the group. So anybody who's interested in the course and find out how they can learn more from you, they will be able to access you. And I want to thank everybody. Please share this information. Go to YouTube, go to my personal page where this video is being streamed, and share, because you have no idea who you can inspire to write or to read more. I think the whole concept of reading and falling in love with humanity through stories, it's such an important message that we got today from Bill. And putting in writing your story, even if you don't want to publish, but write it. I think that we learned a lot of good lessons, and I'm so grateful. Thank you, Bill.
Well, it's been a pleasure, and I really appreciate your love of books. I hope everyone on your podcast shares that love of books. There really is something special about books. Books can make a significant positive difference in our world. So I agree 100% with Miriam. You should all write. Many of you should publish. And if you choose to publish, do become informed so that you can avoid some of the pitfalls, because it's not an easy journey, but it's worthwhile.
100%. Have a good night, everybody.
Okay.